Sony and Microsoft, bitter rivals, right? Then why on May 16, 2019, did they sign a memorandum of understanding to explore joint development in future cloud solutions to support their respective game and content streaming services? Or are they trying to intimidate Google? What does this actually mean? How far has it gone? And what might come of it? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanx, we ask the question, are Microsoft and Sony teaming up to scare Google? Now, as you know, very recently we got a big announcement from Google about Stadia, which, by the way, pretty cool. Honestly, I don't want to sit here and pretend that I have some sort of ill will towards Google for possibly creating a very open and interactive sounding gaming platform. I don't really dislike that. However, we aren't exactly talking about friends letting us borrow their game console so that we can play games only in the cloud. We're talking about companies. In the world of business, most moves are strategic, and they are intended to have specific effects. Now, during a conference in which PlayStation was talking about backwards compatibility, which, let's just go ahead and say, about time you took that seriously, Sony, Chief Executive Officer Jim Ryan said, and I think this is important to note, as of now, there is no partnership between Sony and Microsoft. They simply signed a memorandum of understanding, which shows an intent to seek out any strategic partnerships that might be beneficial for both. During this particular Q&A and in announcements, Sony and Microsoft both acknowledged that they're still competitors and are moving forward with their brands. Sony in particular talking about PlayStation 5. Now, these business negotiations apparently began sometime last year and primarily center around cloud gaming. I don't know if you've played PlayStation Now, but it's a little limited. It's good, it certainly works. I use it to play Metal Gear Solid, but that's about all I really use it for, I'll say. And that's not necessarily a good thing considering how large the PlayStation library actually is if you include all of the consoles, which in theory PlayStation Now should do. It certainly contains games from all of the consoles, but not enough. Part of that is because although Sony invested in Gaikai streaming a few years ago, it really hasn't invested the amount of money in the streaming infrastructure that would be necessary in order to keep up in that sector. Now, obviously, Google has that on lock. They run the largest video platform on the planet, which has streaming that works pretty well. I don't know if you've ever watched a YouTube stream, but it doesn't really have problems in 2019. Similarly, Microsoft has done a lot of investing in its cloud infrastructure, and although there hasn't been a massive amount of really great uses of it in the public as of now, Microsoft Azure is an architecture that, in theory, PlayStation Now probably would benefit from being on. Why? Because it's already huge. Microsoft is way ahead of everybody else as far as developing that platform as a gaming-specific thing anyhow. Where Google definitely does have the advantage in video, it is not running a latency-free operation. Again, YouTube streams are great, and I mentioned that they don't actually have problems, but they are on like a 30-second lag. Google is currently working on those types of problems with the Stadia platform. People's experiences with the Stadia platform also note they haven't ironed that stuff out. The latency may not be so bad, but the actual bitrate of video coming in certainly isn't something to write home about. When we talk about playing games in 4K, we don't want to be playing like 4K highly compressed JPEGs. So when we're talking about exactly what the point of this type of a deal is, it's most likely for Sony to find a home for its streaming service, as well as an infrastructure and people that understand what the hell they're doing. Now, this does not put Sony in the driver's seat, of course. As far as game consoles go, they have a clear advantage with the PlayStation 5 as far as sales and the fact that it's going to be completely backwards compatible. But if Sony's streaming services are running off of Microsoft and being administered by Microsoft, it's still Microsoft making money. That's, however, a long-term issue Sony will have to deal with, and there's no real way to know how they're going to do that. Now, if we're talking about it from this Sony-centric perspective, it could be seen as a bit of a survival move in the streaming space. However, if we consider that Sony and Microsoft are very likely understanding exactly the weight of Google coming into their space, releasing something that is intended to basically compete with their hardware, despite the fact that it is not exactly hardware itself, this is maybe playing offense rather than defense. Google and Amazon are both companies that are highly invested in becoming the leading platform in cloud services. Not gaming cloud services, but cloud services. Well, during the next hardware generation, the Nintendo Switch, although definitely less powerful than whatever Sony and Microsoft are putting out, it's going to be competitive with these two consoles. It's frankly selling similarly to the way the Wii sold, the original Wii, not the Wii U. And if you remember, it actually outsold both the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 at the time. So while there is certainly an element of competition coming in the hardware market, I don't think that Sony and Microsoft are particularly afraid of what is frankly a very different console from their own, completely undermining what they do. Also, although they haven't signed anything, apparently Nintendo itself is gearing up for similar partnerships with Microsoft involving Microsoft Azure. So, regarding the next generation of consoles, the streaming services may very well be operated by Microsoft. However, if you don't need to buy a console, if it's just there, like Google Stadia, and making the assumption that no partnerships happen, Microsoft Azure, PlayStation Now, and a Nintendo service all compete with each other, then you'd likely be working against a company that owns almost all phones. And don't even get me started on Chromecast, which is by far the superior solution for streaming stuff on the TV, which is a place that Stadia will be available at. So for Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo in that situation, their competitor has an install base without selling any new stuff. You may be looking at a bit of a problem for anyone selling gaming hardware. In exploring a possibility of working together on the streaming platforms of the future, they are possibly warding off one of the bigger threats to all of their business, especially as streaming gameplay becomes a normal thing. Now, it's very important to note here, Sony holds some patents that may ultimately result in a better service. It's also important to note that a lot of people are not fond of Google Stadia. Google is kind of, well, let's just look at games on the Google Android phone. They are the harbinger of ads and microtransactions. And interestingly enough, I've seen the perception that games as a service companies would be largely positioned to make lots of money using Google Stadia. Perception of Google Stadia is not great. I am not saying the technology itself could not be good, but as far as actual business experts are concerned, by 2023, which I might add is 4 years from now, it's estimated that less than 2% of the gaming market will be occupied by these types of streaming services. Now, that isn't really super fast growth, and that is to say these services exist today. PlayStation Now exists today. You can play Metal Gear Solid on PlayStation Now, like I said. So all things considered, at least at the moment, and probably during the course of the next console generation, I have to imagine these streaming services are not going to be an existential threat for Microsoft, Sony, or Nintendo. In fact, this 2% may very well be occupied by streaming services augmenting the next Xbox, the PlayStation 5, and even the Nintendo Switch. It's also really worth remembering that even in the United States, there are large areas of this country that do not have good enough infrastructure to handle low latency streaming. There are areas of this country that still have dial-up internet. Now, in 2019, the United States is actually one of the countries that is least far ahead with actual internet speed and infrastructure, which is really weird when you consider all of the companies that do that stuff are here. Yeah, it's odd. It's also important to note that Google has said they have 7,000 edge node locations, so in theory, that latency problem may not actually be one. But the point is, in gaming, the real money isn't there yet. So, well, maybe 50 years into the future, this may be how we're playing games. It's not going to be 5 years into the future. And Microsoft and Sony may even kind of be sending a message that they care about it so little that working together is not like a problem for them. There's no real reason to get super alarmed by this kind of move. In theory, this is the big players kind of investigating the new market, which is a small market. If Sony relies on Microsoft's tech and Microsoft then profits off of Sony's library, they both benefit while both names get a big presence in that area. In the meantime, both the Xbox and PlayStation brand will continue to operate competitively and will very likely continue to dominate the market space. This goes triple if Nintendo gets in on a similar deal. It's just a matter of Microsoft having spent the money on the infrastructure and having the ability to do the thing that both Sony and Nintendo would like to do but would not like to spend the money on the infrastructure. The brands will still be in competition, of course, but the underlying network will be run by a company that has worked on network stuff for a really long time, so I guess that makes sense. Unless they make some big surprise announcements, I wouldn't get like the Sony staff upon hearing this news. Apparently, the PlayStation staff was surprised and needed reassurance the PlayStation 5 was still coming out. And I get that. I get when people worry about stuff like this, but it's also pretty possible this was kind of a marketing move. With the Stadia announcement, Google got a big amount of attention, and though not all of it was positive, it was a lot of attention. This is what seems like a pretty big move that is a little bit earth-shaking, but also isn't an actual firm deal of any kind. Just a memorandum saying we will explore a partnership. And that partnership pertains to something that frankly isn't going to be a big part of the market for quite a while. So don't worry about this. This is not something that is going to affect probably the next console generation at all. It'll be something interesting to pay attention to if we're talking about the actual future of gaming itself, but that's a different topic altogether. What do you think of this potential partnership on gameplay streaming with Microsoft and Sony, and even possibly Microsoft and Nintendo? Leave us a comment, let us know what you think, and if you like this video, please click the like button. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click the subscribe button and don't forget to click the notification bell. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.